Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. In St. Mary Mead, nothing is ever forgotten. A cat's regular route, a widow's second cup of tea, the exact angle at which Miss Weatherby's curtains are drawn, each detail quietly recorded in a ledger not of ink and paper, but of memory, custom, and eyes that rarely blink. It is a village unchanged by speed, untouched by urgency, and entirely certain of its own borders. A place where every face has been known for decades, and strangers are welcomed with politeness, but never with unguarded trust. On the surface, it is peaceful, even dull. There are roses, of course, neatly trimmed and never too bold. There is a grocer with hands like sausages, and a vicar who says grace in Latin when no one asks him to. There are bicycles, pigeons, curtain twitchers, and a path through the churchyard where secrets are buried far deeper than bodies. In this setting, teacups and whispers carry more weight than police reports ever could. At the centre of this tranquil order lies a little corner shop known as Woolen Whispers, its name hand-painted in flaking gold above a fogged window, dressed with hand-knitted booties, mittens, and a large sign reading 50% off mohair, until Thursday. Step inside, and the floorboards creak not with complaint, but with memory. The air smells faintly of cedar, lanolin and starch, and somewhere in the background, always, is the sound of needles clicking softly, like a well-mannered metronome, measuring not time, but silence. This is where the women of the knitting circle gather, always 6, occasionally 7, if Mrs. Latchley is in town, never fewer. They sit at the round oak table near the stove, voices hushed to the precise level at which one might safely discuss arthritis, adultery, and the peculiar contents of someone's handbag without being accused of gossip. The kettle is filled before the door is unlocked, the good teacups come out on Thursdays, and the biscuits are rotated according to a chart which exists only in Mrs. Blackett's head. Mrs. Blackett, the shop's proprietor, is not the sort to wear her past. She dresses plainly, grey cardigans, brown tweeds, an occasional brooch of uncertain origin, and wears her hair in a low chignon fastened with a smooth bone pin. She speaks softly, never forgets an order, and has never, at least in public, raised her voice or an eyebrow. But there are those in the village who remember a time when she did not live here, a time when she was Margaret Simmons, lady's maid at Thornfield Hall. And they remember, too, the suddenness with which she arrived, the hush that surrounded her first few months, and the way her eyes seemed to study a room rather than simply look at it. It was on a Wednesday morning, neither particularly cold nor warm, that she brought out the wooden case. She said little as she opened it. The velvet lining was black, perfectly fitted, and upon it lay a set of bone knitting needles. Ivory white, elegant, unnaturally smooth, each one etched with tiny floral patterns and fitted with delicate metal caps. They were not for sale, that was made clear. They belonged to the Westfields, she said, not quite meeting anyone's gaze. They were passed through the family. These, I believe, were once handled by Mary Queen of Scots. Some say she hid correspondence in the hollow shafts. Whether that's true or not, I cannot say. There was a pause. Tea was sipped. Mrs. Cranley made a dry joke about Tudor stitchwork. Laughter followed, polite and brief. Miss Marple, however, did not laugh. She sat slightly apart from the group that morning, her needles stilled in her lap. She had always been known for her quiet presence, but now there was something extra in the stillness, a sense that she had taken in more than what was shown. She watched Mrs. Blackett's hands, steady but not at ease. She noted how the box had been locked before being shown, and how Mrs. Blackett's eyes flicked toward the front door more than once, as though expecting it to open at the wrong moment. These are not details one remarks upon aloud in St. Mary Mead. One simply remembers them for later, and then shortly after 10, the shop door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, angular, with a beard too carefully trimmed for someone who claimed not to care about such things. He wore a tweed coat, and carried a satchel worn at the seams. He introduced himself, Professor Edwin Hargreaves, from the University of Durham, though no one had asked for a name. He said he was in the village researching Elizabethan domestic history, that he had heard of the knitting circle, that he was interested in local customs, but it was not the wool or the women that caught his eye. It was the case, the needles, and the woman who kept them behind glass. Miss Marple saw it, so did Mrs. Blackett, and just for a second, something passed between them. Not a greeting, not a warning, something else. Tea continued, knitting resumed, and yet there was a shift, soft, almost imperceptible, because from that moment forward, the routine had been nudged off its axis, and in a quiet English village where order was everything, that alone was enough to make someone very, very nervous. For those unfamiliar with the ways of old villages, it is tempting to believe that gossip spreads through malice, but this is a profound misunderstanding. In St. Mary Mead, gossip is not malicious, it is meticulous. It operates with precision, caution, and care, as if everyone involved were part of an unspoken detective bureau charged with the preservation of truth, or at the very least, the prevention of scandal, escaping its appropriate enclosure. By that same afternoon, the name Professor Hargreaves had been spoken aloud in at least 9 households, always with the disclaimer that no judgment had been passed, only noted. It was not just that he asked too many questions, it was how they were asked, about local heirlooms, about the Westfields, about whether Mrs. Blackett had any family still living, and always, his glance drifted toward the cabinet with the bone needles, just for a second too long. It was Mrs. Bandry who first mentioned the letter. She had seen Mrs. Blackett posting it herself, 2 mornings prior, just after the grocer's lorry had passed. Not a large envelope, but substantial enough to require careful sealing. Addressed, she claimed, to London, though she hadn't leaned close enough to read the full line. She would never do such a thing, of course. But the addressee began with British Moo, and there were not so many destinations that began with those syllables. By Thursday, the knitting circle had returned to Woolen Whispers for its regular meeting. The kettle whistled, the biscuits were ginger this time, and the conversation wandered from garden frost to Mrs. Cranley's cousin's hip operation. But Miss Marple, as usual, knitted very little. Her ball of yarn, rose pink of fine cashmere blend, sat in her lap, barely touched. She watched Mrs. Blackett more closely than she intended to, and not without cause. The woman was distracted. Her hands, normally methodical, fumbled when refolding a lace sampler. She miscounted change. She responded to direct questions with a 2-second delay, the sort that signals a mind elsewhere, far, far elsewhere. And when Miss Marple asked her, as gently as one might ask the weather how it is feeling today, whether she had heard anything from her family in London, there was a pause too long for comfort. "I've," Blackett said, voice even, but her eyes fixed on the wool bin. None worth mentioning at any rate. Yet by Friday morning, a letter arrived at the shop, and within 24 hours, so did Diana Westfield. She was young, or younger than most expected, a woman of perhaps 33, with gloved hands, a well-tailored coat, and a suitcase that looked far too expensive for someone claiming to be the niece of a village shopkeeper. She arrived not with mourning, but with certainty. She knew where to go, she knew what to say, she asked for keys, and she claimed without hesitation that Mrs. Blackett, her aunt, had left the shop to her. What Miss Marple noted more than anything was that no one had ever heard her name mentioned before, not once, not ever. The knitting circle gathered the next day with an energy closer to vigilance than sociality. Biscuits were untouched, tea was poured but forgotten. Diana Westfield, having taken up a place behind the counter where Mrs. Blackett had stood just days before, made polite conversation but avoided any personal detail. She smiled too often, and never genuinely. And once, while rearranging skeins near the display cabinet, she slipped her hand into the drawer below and quickly withdrew it, thinking no one had noticed. Miss Marple had. So had Mrs. Cranley, though she would never say so aloud. That evening, the windows of St. Mary Mead flickered one by one as lamps were turned off. But Miss Marple stayed on far longer than usual. She sat by her small fire, the pink cashmere yarn now fully wound, and returned to its place. In its stead, she held a small envelope, unaddressed, and a sheet of thick, cream-coloured paper folded once, twice, then tucked carefully into a drawer. Her expression gave away nothing, but in her eyes was the trace of something rare, concern. Because there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her.
By Saturday afternoon, the rhythm of St. Mary Mead had shifted just enough to make the regulars uneasy. Diana Westfield, still referring to herself as the rightful heir to Wool and Whispers, had taken to rearranging the shelves, removing long-established displays, and correcting the labelling on yarn weights that had been trusted for over a decade. She claimed, with a gracious smile, that she was simply modernizing. But in a village like this, modernizing was only another word for trespass. Miss Marple returned to the shop just before closing, ostensibly to collect a skein she had forgotten, but more truthfully, to observe what had not been said aloud. There was something unmistakably wrong, though no one could place it. It wasn't that Diana was unfriendly. She wasn't. It wasn't that she seemed unfeeling about her aunt's abrupt absence, though she did. No, it was that Diana Westfield was far too comfortable for someone surrounded by strangers, and far too confident for someone whose claim had yet to be confirmed. What she lacked, Miss Marple noted silently, was grief, or curiosity, or memory. It was then, just as the bell over the shop door jingled behind her, that Miss Marple saw it. A ball of cashmere wool, pink, her shade had been placed on the counter. Attached to it was a tag in Mrs. Blackett's hand, marked only with the name Jane, a gift, perhaps, or a signal. Either way, it had been reserved for her. Quietly, deliberately, she took it home, and that night, when the village had gone to sleep, she did something she rarely did outside the daylight hours. She examined the wool, not with idle fingers, but with purpose. The ball had been rewound, not by machine, but by hand, an unfamiliar hand, too tight, too uneven, and tucked within, nearly invisible, was something hard, a sliver of ivory. At first glance, a splinter, on closer examination, a piece of carved bone. Miss Marple did not sleep that night. By morning she had retrieved her notebook, small, bound in leather, its pages filled with years of quiet observations, and began writing. At the top of the new page, she did not begin with the name Diana Westfield, nor did she begin with Professor Hargreaves. She began with one word only, needles, because it was never the inheritance that mattered. Not really, nor the story of royal provenance. Those were window dressings. It was what the needles contained that drew danger to Wool and Whispers, and somewhere among the skeins and the shelves, among the gloves and lace collars, someone was willing to risk everything for what those artifacts hid. Someone clever, someone calm, someone who had waited until now to act. Perhaps because Mrs. Blackett had written to the museum, perhaps because the past was catching up, or perhaps because secrets once locked inside bone do not stay buried forever. Miss Marple folded her hands. The lamp beside her flickered once, then steadied. The knitting circle would meet again on Tuesday. She would be there. She would bring the pink wool, and she would be watching. Because this was no longer a matter of lace and loyalty. This was a question of broken trust, a secret crime, and a cold-blooded pursuit of something that had remained hidden for decades. And whoever stood behind it, whether out of greed, revenge, or guilt, had just made one fatal mistake. Now it was only a matter of patience, and Miss Marple had always been exceptionally patient. If you're still listening, tell us, where are you watching from, and what do you believe could bring justice for this village scandal? Could the truth be hiding in plain sight? Could a knitting needle hold the answer? Subscribe now, because the next chapter may just uncover the body in the library, and Miss Marple's most delicate case is only just beginning.
Chapter 2. The Inciting Incident. The rain arrived with a slowness that suited St. Mary Mead. First a shift in the wind, then a curtain of mist along the lane, and finally the rhythmic tap of water on tiled rooftops that gave the impression of privacy without truly offering it. The shops closed early, curtains were drawn, and fireplaces were tended with an attentiveness usually reserved for guests of honour. Inside her cottage on Old Partridge Row, Miss Marple sat in her wing-back chair near the fire, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. It was not yet complete. A soft wool glove in that same pale celadon shade she'd been working for 3 weeks, but her attention had drifted from stitches to thoughts, which for her was usually when things became interesting. She thought, not for the first time that week, of Mrs. Blackett, not about her smile or her manner, both of which were consistently neutral, nor about her knitting, which was technically sound but unremarkable. No, it was the tremor in her left hand, observed 3 days prior when pouring tea, and the quick, almost imperceptible glance toward the bone needles locked in the display cabinet. A glance that did not come from vanity or nostalgia, but from concern. Mrs. Blackett had always been a woman of control, and control, once compromised, is louder than any scream. The storm deepened. Thunder cracked in the distance, though the lightning was far off, so faint it barely lit the clouds. It was during this long stretch of grey rain and low thunder that something shifted. A silence fell that wasn't quite natural, and in St. Mary Mead, where silence is a language, this was the equivalent of a cry. The news arrived the following morning. Woolen Whispers had not opened. No kettle whistled, no bell above the door, no clink of cups or creak of the old oak floor. It was Mrs. Banbury who first noticed her umbrella angled against the wind as she waited at the door with a package to collect. She waited 20 minutes. Then she knocked. Then, lips pursed, she walked directly to the vicar's and made a telephone call. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Slack was on the scene, though not, as he would say later, out of concern, only duty. He was a man who distrusted mess, especially emotional ones, and wore his suspicion like an old overcoat, serviceable, never stylish. The shop was entered by official means. The front door was locked, the back too. No windows broken, no signs of disturbance. In fact, everything appeared maddeningly normal. Biscuits in a tin, a tea towel half folded, the wood stove cold but clean, and then they reached the storeroom. There, in the far corner, behind a curtain once used to shield discontinued bolts of muslin, lay Mrs. Blackett, still, composed, not sprawled, not folded, simply resting, unnaturally still. At her side a single knitting needle, ivory, unmarked but unmistakably part of the displayed set, the finest of them, the thinnest, the one rumoured to contain something hidden in its hollow shaft. There was no evidence of struggle, no disarray, but two details stood out immediately. First, the teacup. On a small tray near the rear work table sat 2 cups, one with its usual floral pattern, the other plain white, unused. The floral cup bore a faint trace of rose-coloured lipstick, not a shade Mrs. Blackett wore, not ever. And second, the needles. Of the original antique set, only 6 remained in the case. 1 had been left on the ground, 2 were missing. Miss Marple, upon arrival, stood near the display, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She spoke to no one. She examined everything. The yarn basket, the cabinet, the odd scent in the air, not perfume, but something faintly metallic. Her gaze settled last on a ball of cashmere wool tucked near the register, pale rose, her colour. The wool had been rewound, not poorly, not carelessly, but not with Mrs. Blackett's touch. She did not speak aloud the thought, but it came fully formed. Someone had searched, not for money, not for valuables, for something light enough to fit inside yarn, and heavy enough to justify risk. By noon, the shop had been cordoned in the softest of ways. No police tape, no raised voices, only a sign reading "closed until further notice," and a subtle increase in the number of villagers walking past the window. The rain had stopped by then, but the damp lingered, a kind of weight in the air. And then came Diana Westfield. She arrived from London in a dark car, black-gloved and prepared, the kind of arrival that is both timed and rehearsed. She stepped into the shop, not with sorrow, but with ownership. She did not cry. She did not ask questions. She stated facts. My aunt, my inheritance. Her instructions were very clear, but St. Mary Mead did not remember any mention of her. Not by name, not by letter, not even once. She addressed the villagers with ease. She told them how fond she was of the countryside, how she had spent summers here as a child, a claim no one could verify. She referred to Mrs. Blackett in the past tense, affectionately, but without detail, and within an hour she had requested the cabinet keys. Miss Marple had said nothing through it all. She simply returned home, poured herself tea, then when alone began to unwind the ball of yarn she'd taken from the shop. Her hands slowed halfway through, her eyes narrowed,
and within the soft twist of the wool, her fingers found something cool, rigid and unnatural, a bone needle, hollow, the end capped with a faint seam. She unscrewed it carefully, revealing a tightly rolled scrap of parchment, a seal, red wax, a crest not of this century. She did not read it, not yet. Instead, she replaced it inside the needle, wrapped the wool once more, and placed the ball, not back into her basket, but into her sewing box, beneath the thimble she had not used since 1964. The next day, she returned to the shop. Diana was behind the counter, and Professor Hargreaves too was back in the village. Nothing was said, but everything had changed. By Sunday, the talk in St. Mary Mead was no longer of weather, or scones, or the state of the vicar's begonias. It was about woolen whispers, about the shop's strange stillness, about the questions hanging in the air like mist over the graveyard wall, questions which, in a village of this type, are never asked directly, but always answered in whispers. And so the village watched. They watched as Diana Westfield opened the shop, precisely at 9, turned the sign in the door, swept the step without being asked. They watched as she placed Mrs. Blackett's framed photograph on the front counter, tasteful, smiling, too recent to match the memory held by those who'd known her when she first arrived. They watched her make tea, not in the chipped cream pot Mrs. Blackett had used since the early 2000s, but in a newer, sleeker kettle, black, with a faint metallic shine that some found vulgar. But what they noticed most was the glass case. It had been moved, slightly, just enough, and 2 of the antique bone needles were still absent. It was Miss Marple who returned again, unobtrusive as ever, with a folded bag in one hand and a polite excuse about running out of grey alpaca. She moved about the shop slowly, like someone unsure of her footing, though her footing was perfectly secure. She let her eyes rest on Diana's every movement. The woman did not speak of her aunt unless prompted. She spoke instead about her plans for the shop, more colour, perhaps, new stock from abroad, knitting tutorials for school children. It was meant to sound generous, but to Miss Marple's trained ear, it reeked of distraction. What Diana Westfield wanted, more than anything, was not to be asked the wrong kind of question. Professor Hargreaves reappeared later that morning. His expression was, as always, unreadable. He introduced himself to Diana with a politeness too well rehearsed, and she returned the courtesy with an ease that felt, at least to Miss Marple, suspiciously unforced. They knew each other, that much was clear, but whether they admitted it aloud was another matter. It was during their short exchange, 3 minutes no more, that Miss Marple noticed a detail no one else had yet remarked upon. Hargreaves' eyes were not on the needles, they were on Diana, and hers were never on him. They circled each other, conversationally, like dancers who had practiced the same routine too many times to feign spontaneity. Later, Miss Marple spoke briefly with Colonel Bantry, not about Diana, not about Hargreaves, but about Thornfield Hall, about what had gone missing in 1952, about the letter Mrs. Blackett had posted and the British Museum's recent interest in Elizabethan correspondences discovered outside formal archives. She returned home and opened the sewing box once more. The bone needle was exactly where she had left it. Still cool to the touch, still holding something not meant for ordinary hands, and the question now grew sharper. Who had known the letter was being sent? Who had come for the shop? And why had Mrs. Blackett chosen, of all people, to entrust the wool to Miss Marple? The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. The rain returned that night, not heavy but persistent, falling in sheets so fine that they seemed to vanish before touching the ground, and yet leaving everything faintly wet. Lights glowed behind lace curtains, and tea was poured in silence. The village had slipped into its evening ritual, but at the end of Mallow Lane, one window remained lit far later than the rest. Inside, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, a small notepad before her, open but barely marked. She was not one to write until she knew what she meant to say. Her pen rested across the top margin. Below, only 3 names: Blackett, Westfield, Hargreaves. A triangle, neat, quietly dangerous. The next morning brought no new comfort. Inspector Slack had returned to the shop, professional but irritated, as always, by Miss Marple's presence, though unable to fully ignore her either. He had reviewed the scene, taken statements, examined the body. No sign of robbery, no forced entry, no disorder, only the stillness. And the needle, he called it unusual. Miss Marple called it deliberate. The needle had entered at the base of the skull, cleanly, without hesitation. No jagged edge, no wasted motion. It had been chosen carefully, and used with knowledge. Slack, who disliked speculation, dismissed the idea of expertise, but he could not explain the absence of hesitation, nor could he explain the lipstick on the teacup, or why the second cup, untouched, matched none of the sets in the shop. But it was Diana's return that confirmed Miss Marple's unease. She arrived again just after lunch, carrying a box she said belonged to her aunt. She claimed it contained documents, old receipts, personal things. But when she stepped behind the counter, she did something no one else would have noticed. She glanced at the cabinet before opening the box. Just a glance, fractional, but unmistakable, and later that day, Professor Hargreaves was seen leaving the shop through the back door, though the front had been locked since 3. No one saw what he carried, but Mrs. Withers, who had taken to watching the alley from her back parlour, mentioned a coat that bulged slightly on the left side. She didn't like to say so, but she did.
The following evening, Miss Marple made her final visit to the shop that week. The wool shelves had been rearranged, the photographs had changed, but the needles, those that remained, had not moved. 6 now, precisely 6. The missing pair were not mentioned, not by Diana, not by Slack, not by anyone, but they were missing all the same. Miss Marple returned home and placed her sewing box back on the highest shelf, locked, and then she made tea, not because she needed it, but because tea gave one time to think. There was no doubt now. Something had been hidden in those needles. A deadly secret, passed from history into the hands of a woman who knew its value far too late. And someone close, had decided it was worth everything to possess it. It was a twisted mind, not a moment of madness, a cold-blooded choice. The next day would bring questions, from Scotland Yard, from London, from the museum. But Miss Marple already knew. This was a case about obsession, betrayal, and something long forgotten resurfacing through the quiet patterns of everyday life. She looked out across the village as the rain began again. There was no sound but the clock, ticking softly, and then she wrote one more line in her notebook, beneath the names already listed. Needles, 2, missing, 1 hidden, 1 used. This was no longer a quiet English mystery. It was a tea and murder affair, and the next stitch would reveal far more than anyone expected. Chapter 3. Unravelling the Past. It began, as the most significant conversations do, with a pot of tea and a silence longer than usual. Miss Marple, seated in Colonel Bantry's study, stirred 2 lumps of sugar into her cup with deliberate care, though she neither liked nor required them. The fire crackled gently. Outside, rain pattered against the windows in a manner so polite it might have been knocking for permission, and across from her, Colonel Bantry waited, not impatiently, but with the sort of expectancy worn by those who know that something important is coming and that it will arrive only when the speaker is quite ready. Miss Marple did not delay much longer. "Do you recall Margaret Simmons?" Colonel Bantry blinked once, his hand pausing halfway to the biscuit tin. Then, with a grunt of memory, he set it down and leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over a wool vest that had seen better decades. "Thornfield Hall, maid to the old Westfield. Quiet girl, disappeared not long after the funeral. Why?" Miss Marple's reply came as though from somewhere far deeper than mere curiosity. "She didn't disappear, Arthur. She simply changed her name. She became Mrs. Blackett, of Woolen Whispers." He stared at her. "Are you sure?" She gave the faintest nod. "Quite. It was not conjecture, not village whispering. It was fact, confirmed not by documents, but by the tiniest of tells. A photograph hidden in a drawer, a birthday remembered wrong on purpose, a monogram burned faintly into the leather of an old sewing kit." Miss Marple had noticed them all. She always did, and once the name had surfaced, the past could no longer remain buried. Thornfield Hall, long since shuttered and divided into awkward flats, had been a place of quiet privilege and louder secrets. Lord Westfield, its last true occupant, was a man known for his collection of antiquities, most notably Tudor-era artefacts that had passed through auction houses, manor vaults, and occasionally, less transparent sources. Among them, it was whispered, was a set of Elizabethan knitting needles, bone, hollow, elaborately carved, and said to contain messages smuggled by Mary Queen of Scots herself. It was precisely these that had found their way, decades later, into a locked glass case at Wool and Whispers. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Not only had Margaret Simmons once served in that very house, but she had left shortly after Lord Westfield's death, under circumstances never clearly explained. No police inquiry, no scandal, only quiet departure, and even quieter rumour. Items had gone missing from the estate, not paintings or silver, but smaller things, personal items, and one document, catalogued by the British Museum but never recovered, an unaccounted letter bearing the Elizabethan seal. Colonel Bantry scratched his chin. "You think she brought them here? That she kept them all this time?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that she was waiting for the right moment to tell the truth. But something, or someone, had intervened before that moment could come." Miss Marple's next visit was not to the museum, nor the archives, but to Wool and Whispers itself. She waited until the late afternoon, when the shop was quiet, and Diana Westfield had momentarily stepped out. Then, with gloves on and steps as silent as memory, she moved behind the counter and examined the fireplace, not the grate, nor the hearth, but the recess just beneath the mantel. And there, tucked between the bricks, blackened and fragile, she found the edges of a page half consumed by flame. Most of it was lost, names blurred, lines melted into ash, but the heading remained: Royal Correspondence, Catalogue Reference 1/1746b, Repayant, British Museum. It had been a letter of intent. She had meant to send them, the needles, the parchment, the truth, to a proper place, to preserve history, perhaps even to clear her name. But the letter had been burned, not misplaced, not forgotten, deliberately destroyed. By whom, Miss Marple did not yet know, but she could guess who had reason. Diana Westfield's story had never felt right, a niece never mentioned, an inheritance too conveniently claimed. Her confidence was not that of grief, but of strategy, and when asked casually, harmlessly, whether she remembered the layout of Mrs. Blackett's kitchen, she had faltered, named a window that did not exist, confused the hallway for the pantry. She had never lived there, not even for a day. Professor Hargreaves, for his part, had grown less subtle. He lingered in the village longer than his stated research demanded. He frequented the bakery, not for buns, but to watch who came and went. He had, on more than one occasion, been seen walking past the shop after dark. When questioned gently about his knowledge of the Westfield collection, he had laughed, shrugged, and changed the subject, but not before referencing the hollowed needle rumour, not before calling it folklore worth re-examining, which meant he knew the value of what Mrs. Blackett had protected, and perhaps who else knew too. The wool Miss Marple had unspooled now sat locked in a drawer in her sitting room. The bone needle, unscrewed only once, had been reassembled and stored in a sewing tin beneath a quilt no one had touched in years. It was no longer about a shopkeeper, or a niece, or even a death. It was about something that went deeper, a legacy protected, a trust betrayed, and a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to erase. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Miss Marple had nearly all the pieces, but she would not place them just yet, not until she was sure who was playing whom. By Tuesday morning, the clouds had lifted, but the mood in St. Mary Mead had not. The shop stood open, yet oddly hollow, like a stage missing its leading actress. Diana Westfield moved about behind the counter with studied confidence, greeting regulars by name, dusting the cabinet glass with a new cloth no one had ever seen before. There was an artificial brightness to her voice, like a record played half a note too fast. She offered tea. She smiled. But when asked about Mrs. Blackett's recipes for lavender sachets, she couldn't name a single ingredient. Miss Marple stood at the yarn bin nearest the till, hands lightly brushing the rows of wool, her movements casual, her thoughts anything but. The museum's letter, what remained of it, was now carefully pressed in tissue paper inside her writing desk. The charred corner still bore part of the seal,
Royal, 17th century, wax as brittle as parchment. She asked Diana, quite kindly, whether she had located any paperwork regarding the supposed inheritance. "Oh," Diana replied, without missing a beat, "my aunt was very private about that sort of thing, but everything was settled ages ago." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, not high enough to offend, but just enough to measure. "And yet," she murmured, "no solicitor has contacted the bank." Diana offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps they're just slow. In St. Mary Mead, slow is never the reason." Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to revisit old military files. He found little on Diana Westfield, though that in itself was telling. No records of employment, no flat listed in her name, no travel under that identity before 2021, and nothing to link her, legally or otherwise, to Margaret Simmons. No birth certificate, no photos, not a trace of familial connection, apart from her word. And words, as Miss Marple well knew, could be designed like knitting patterns, decorative, symmetrical, and entirely misleading. The next visit came from Professor Hargreaves, now dressed less like a tourist and more like someone with errands. He carried a leather satchel and asked publicly, with performative casualness, whether anyone had seen a black notebook he might have left near the fireplace. No one had. Miss Marple simply nodded and offered him shortbread, but as he reached for a piece, she noticed a ring on his finger, ornate, old, and quite out of place, gold filigree. A Tudor crest, unmistakably authentic. It had not been on his hand last week, and the moment he saw her looking, he tucked his hand behind his back. She said nothing, but made a note. The net was tightening, but it wasn't the police drawing it in. It was knowledge. Small, tidy facts connected like stitches, row by row, until the pattern revealed itself. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to the shop once more. Not to shop, but to watch. The wool display had changed again. The pink cashmere skein had been moved. The needles, still 6, had been rearranged, and a new box sat beneath the counter, locked. Diana, noticing Miss Marple's gaze, touched the lid almost instinctively. "Just old papers," she said. "Ah," Miss Marple replied, "I find it's the old papers that tell the most unpleasant truths." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Diana's eyes. Not fear, not even guilt, annoyance. It was all Miss Marple needed. She now had motive, opportunity, and deception, all in plain sight, but not yet the final link. That would come soon, and when it did, the entire story, spun so carefully, for so long, would begin to twist. There is something curious about fire. It consumes, but does not forget. Ash carries memory in a different form, and Miss Marple, ever the student of transformation, had begun to understand precisely what Margaret Simmons, Mrs. Blackett, had tried to preserve, and what someone else had worked so desperately to destroy. 2 nights later, the last of the village's doubts quietly evaporated. It began with a visit to the vicarage, not to pray, though Miss Marple was known to, nor to deliver knitted mittens for the orphanage raffle. This visit was prompted by something rather more delicate. The vicar, an amateur collector of historical oddments, had once displayed a Tudor sealing kit at a local fair. Miss Marple, recalling its peculiar stamp and crimson wax, asked if she might see it again. He obliged gladly, offering not only the kit, but a small folio of copied correspondences, items of no great value, he said, but interesting all the same. One slip of paper caught her eye, a facsimile of an old note, addressed to Messamine, unsigned save for the initials E.W. The handwriting, curvaceous, deliberate, was identical to a scrap Miss Marple had found lining the bottom of a sewing drawer at Woolen Whispers. In ink faded but legible, the note read, "Do not trust Edward. If anything happens, take the needles, hide them." The initials did not belong to Lord Westfield. They matched another member of the family, Edward Westfield, his nephew, who had contested the will quietly and disappeared just as quietly into university halls and foreign expeditions. He had returned to England only once since, under an assumed name, Professor Hargreaves. There it was, the scandal no one had spoken of aloud, the deadly secret preserved not in vaults but in yarn and habit, Hargreaves Edward had returned to find the very thing his uncle denied him, a collection of artifacts far more valuable than their appearance betrayed. Margaret Simmons had taken them, perhaps by order, perhaps by desperation, and hidden them in plain sight, and when she prepared to expose the truth, he had moved quickly, not recklessly, but with just enough haste to leave behind errors, the ring, the ashes, the changed wool, the missing needle, and then of course there was Diana, or rather Patricia Westfield, daughter of Edward, raised abroad, taught the family legends like bedtime stories, and now posing as an heir to claim what her father could not, a cold-blooded cover-up, a brutal betrayal, stretching across decades, stitched into the very fabric of a quiet English village. The confrontation was not theatrical. Miss Marple never allowed herself the luxury of drama, but it was definitive. She returned to the shop, needle case in hand, and requested to speak with both Diana and the professor. It was nearing dusk. The shop was quiet. They agreed, though warily. Miss Marple opened the bone needle, slowly, carefully. The parchment within was still intact, rolled tight, royal seal compressed in the hollow shaft. She placed it on the counter. Neither Diana nor the professor touched it, and then she asked one question: who burned the letter? No answer came, but their eyes moved, not to each other, but toward the back-room door. A fatal mistake. The silence, she later recalled, wasn't empty. It was watching. That evening, she penned a letter of her own, to Inspector Slack, respectful, discreet, and definitive in its implications. She included a list of items to be retrieved and requested quietly that no arrests be made until the next morning. The past, after all, had waited this long. The twisted mind behind the knitting needle killer would not run, nor would the one who had helped conceal the crime. They had underestimated Margaret Simmons, and they had greatly underestimated Miss Marple. Before we continue, tell us who killed Mrs. Blackett, the knitting needle that told the truth, the secret she took to her grave. Tell us, where are you watching from, and what you believe can bring justice in this tangled village scandal.
Chapter 4. The Missing Needle. There are moments in life when silence holds its breath. Not merely an absence of sound, but a quiet weighted with meaning, as if the walls themselves were listening, remembering. And on that unassuming Wednesday morning in St. Mary Mead, the stillness inside Woolen Whispers carried precisely such weight. Miss Marple, seated in the shadow of the knitting needles display, had come not for tea, nor for her usual bundle of merino, but under the gentle guise of sorting out the shop's scattered supply cabinet, a task she had once offered to assist Mrs. Blackett with, though the poor woman never quite permitted her. That morning, no one stood in her way. Diana, curiously absent for the day, had handed over the shop keys after a seemingly reluctant pause and the faintest of forced smiles. "Only for a few hours," she had said. "I do hope nothing's too out of place." Miss Marple responded with her customary warmth, but inwardly noted the defensive inflection in Diana's tone. It was the kind of voice worn by someone who's hidden something, not quite well enough. She entered the back storeroom precisely at 10:45 and locked the door behind her, not out of secrecy, but to ensure her thoughts remained uninterrupted. The scent of lavender sachets and cedar-lined drawers lingered. It was oddly comforting. There were boxes, labels, stray skeins of hand-dyed wool, and beneath it all, the kind of mess that only the recently departed leave behind, organized by memory, not method. She knelt by the supply cabinet, fingers brushing gently past the embroidery silks and lacework bobbins. Her hands, though aged, moved with deliberate precision. Behind the cabinet, to the left, a narrow scuff marked the floorboard. It was no wider than the length of a finger, but it curved oddly, as if something flat had been pried open and replaced. Miss Marple fetched her knitting needle, the practical one, not the antique, and gave the groove a light prod. It shifted. She lifted the floorboard with care and uncovered a metal box, small, rectangular, tarnished with age. There was no lock, no label, just a slight resistance as she opened the lid. Inside lay a ball of pale cashmere wool, its colour so delicate it looked almost luminous in the dim light. Nestled at the centre of the skein was one of the bone needles, The design was unmistakable, carved with care, its shaft thicker than it ought to have been. She held it gently in her hand, and turning it, noticed a seam, barely visible, cleverly disguised. She twisted the top. It loosened. From the hollow within slid a scroll. Parchment, old, fragile. She unrolled it just enough to see the first few lines. Latin, unmistakable. The ink had faded, but was legible still. At the very bottom, a signature, Maria R., Mary Queen of Scots. She exhaled, not from shock, but from confirmation. Mrs. Blackett hadn't been guarding folklore or sentiment. She had been protecting history. This was no collector's myth. This was a letter, concealed, encoded, and threaded through time. It was, in every sense, a deadly secret. She rewrapped the parchment, placed it back within the needle, and folded the wool around it, just as she had found it. Her thoughts moved quickly. If one needle contained this, the others might hold even more. Secrets, confessions, names lost to time. And yet why conceal them here? Unless, of course, Mrs. Blackett had not yet completed the task. The sound of footsteps outside the storeroom interrupted her thoughts. She waited, still, silent. The knob turned, locked. The figure hesitated, then moved away. Miss Marple tucked the wool skein under her arm, returned the floorboard, and smoothed the mat back over its place. She opened the door to an empty shop. Only the silence remained. That evening, under the mantle of gathering dusk, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the constabulary. She carried no bag, no fanfare, only the wool ball, and a calmness born of purpose. Inspector Slack, ever skeptical, greeted her with folded arms and a sour twist of the lip. He had learned over time, and at considerable cost to his pride, not to dismiss her observations outright. "You've brought wool," he noted, dry as chalk. "Yes," she answered serenely, "and something else." With steady hands, she laid out the needle, then unwound the wool to reveal the scroll. His eyes, narrowed and doubtful, widened slightly as she twisted the bone casing and let the parchment slip free. "Latin," he murmured, unable to disguise his surprise. "You'll want Hargreaves to read it," she said. "He's familiar with Tudor cipher." Slack, muttering about antiques and academics, nonetheless took the object with a gentleness that betrayed his growing interest. The parchment, delicate as gossamer, had acquired a new kind of authority, the kind that altered cases, the kind that attracted headlines. But Miss Marple had no use for headlines. Her interest lay in motives and the quiet cracks in a person's performance. By the time she returned home, the village had darkened. From her parlour window she saw Diana walking briskly past the bakery, coat unfastened, eyes darting. Suspicion had shadowed that young woman since her first arrival, but now it ripened. That night, Miss Marple couldn't sleep. The events of the day formed a loop, playing softly, insistently. Her mind circled the needle, the scroll, the unfinished business. The wool ball had been untouched, yet Diana knew the shop. She knew where the cabinets stood, which floorboards creaked. She had lied, and lies, Miss Marple always said, were a currency most people spent too freely. Shortly after midnight, movement returned to the shop. She had taken to sitting near the parlour window with her knitting, not for the blanket she was working on, but to listen. The faint click of keys, the hush of a door. Someone had entered woolen whispers. There was no official access, not after the incident. She slipped out the front, slippered feet silent on the path. Crossing the green, she remained a silhouette against the hedgerows. From her vantage behind the trellis, she saw the flicker of a lantern inside. Not a light, a lantern. Diana, caught in the dim illumination, the young woman was rifling through the back shelves, not with the grace of habit, but with desperation. Every motion suggested panic. A bag slung over her shoulder, she patted down the yarn, pressed on panels, searched beneath stacked bins. She was looking for something. Or rather, she had lost something. Miss Marple waited until the flicker dimmed. Diana, having found nothing, left the same way she entered. The lantern's glow dwindled, and then vanished altogether. Miss Marple remained under the trellis, still as stone, for several minutes more. Something was unspooling, far faster than anyone realized, and Diana Westfield was standing in its center.
By sunrise, the rhythm of village life resumed, carts rattling over cobbles, church bells echoing with sleepy punctuality, and the clink of teacups at the bakery's porch. But Miss Marple's morning did not follow its usual ritual. She arrived once more at Wool and Whispers, not with a mission this time, but to observe who else would show. It was Diana, earlier than expected, eyes dulled by fatigue, clutching a folded note in her hand. Miss Marple watched from a polite distance, her curiosity sharpened, her sympathy genuine but guarded. Diana unlocked the shop, stepped inside, then paused abruptly as if remembering something unfinished. 15 minutes later, Inspector Slack arrived. Called by Diana, or summoned by guilt. No one could say for certain, but what transpired inside the shop remained obscured behind closed shutters and drawn curtains. Only the expression on Slack's face when he exited, half disturbed, half awoken, hinted at the gravity within. Miss Marple paid her visit at noon. She asked no questions, merely returned a spool of thread and a quiet "How are you, my dear?" to Diana. The reply was strained but civil, and then, just as she turned to leave, Miss Marple saw something out of place, a second wool skein on the counter, identical to the one she had found. She turned back gently. "May I?" Diana hesitated. "It's just something I was sorting." But Miss Marple was already lifting the wool, noting the faint, unnatural weight. With a careful twist, the needle fell into her palm. This one, too, held a hollow core, and inside not parchment, but a torn corner of correspondence. Ash-smudged, yet unmistakably museum-grade letterhead. It was all part of the same secret crime. The cover-up had begun with deception, and now depended on silence. As she handed it back to Diana, Miss Marple smiled. "It's quite a legacy you've stepped into."
The young woman's expression flickered. Not quite guilt, not quite fear. Chapter 5. The trap is set. There are occasions in village life when quiet is not merely quiet, it's anticipatory, like the last breath drawn before an accusation is made aloud. And on the morning, Miss Marple quietly allowed word to drift across hedgerows and hedges that a remarkable object had been found. St. Mary Mead transformed from a sleepy quilt of whispers to something sharper. It began in the post office, as so many things did, when Mrs. Elspeth Rundle told Mr. Figg the grocer, unnecessarily loudly, that Miss Marple had stumbled upon something terribly rare beneath the wool stock in the shop. No specifics were given, but Elspeth's eyebrows and tone had done most of the heavy lifting. Within an hour, the vicar's wife had heard, and by afternoon so had the undertaker's apprentice, though precisely what he thought of it no one ever asked. Miss Marple was deliberate in her orchestration. She made no formal announcement, but she was present enough, greeting villagers, smiling knowingly at questions, feigning forgetfulness when pressed, and thus curiosity bloomed with purpose. Tension thickened. At the bakery, patrons paused mid-scone. Even those who dismissed the entire affair spoke of it twice as much. One man muttered that he didn't believe a word, but asked for details anyway. That Thursday afternoon, with the scent of lavender still clinging to the parlour curtains and a kettle murmuring on the range, Miss Marple arranged her knitting samples in the front room of her cottage. She had invited no fewer than 9 ladies of the knitting circle for what she called a demonstration of historic purling techniques. Most came. 2 sent regrets, and 2 others, Professor Hargreaves and Diana Westfield, arrived uninvited. The professor, ever the intellectual vulture, appeared precisely at 3. He offered compliments on the geraniums, then eyed the display table with transparent interest. Diana arrived moments later, late enough to avoid introductions, early enough to inspect the room. She was dressed plainly, but her posture was tense, shoulders set just a fraction too high, eyes flitting like a metronome. Miss Marple welcomed them both with a warmth that masked watchfulness. The conversation, initially about yarn weight and needle gauge, turned gradually, intentionally, toward topics of age, heirlooms, and the curious ways people protected things they loved. Diana barely concealed her alertness. It was when the tea tray was served that Miss Marple produced it, the letter, folded, fragile, left casually by the biscuit tin. "Oh dear," she said, "I nearly forgot. I found this tucked into an old knitting pattern. Latin, I think. I hadn't the faintest notion what it meant. Hargreaves's eyes narrowed. Diana's teacup paused at her lip. No one reached for it. The room held its breath. Outside, unseen by all but the cats and a particularly lazy pigeon, Colonel Bantry and Inspector Slack waited in the garden shed. They had been briefed hours earlier and positioned by Miss Marple herself. The window in the parlour had been left fractionally open, not enough to chill the room, but enough to allow sound to travel. Slack had protested the plan, of course, until Bantry reminded him how many times she'd been right. Back inside, Diana finally broke the silence. "It's a lovely piece," she said. "Surely it's just decorative." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Yes, most likely." The tension cracked, but only just. Hargreaves excused himself to inspect the letter, carefully, too carefully. He did not touch it, he only stared. Diana's hands tightened in her lap. Conversation resumed, but it had shifted. What had been chatter became chess. Every compliment was now a distraction, every story a screen. Hargreaves spoke of his research. Diana asked after the vicar's wife, all while watching each other and her. As the clock struck 4, the tea was finished, the samples repacked. Miss Marple, always the polite hostess, escorted her guests to the door, thanked them each, and bid them farewell. Only once the gate clicked behind them did she exhale. A net had been cast, and 2 very different fish had swum straight into it. Later that evening, with the knitting wool packed away, and the window once more shut against the breeze, Miss Marple reviewed the afternoon's performance in solitude. The expressions, the pauses, the very calculated silences, every piece of the puzzle shifting, tightening. It was not merely the presence of Diana and Hargreaves that had intrigued her. It was the nature of their restraint. The professor, for all his academic aloofness, had let a muscle twitch beneath his eye when the letter was introduced. A learned man would of course take interest, but he had taken none of the curiosity a scholar might show, and all the apprehension a conspirator might fear. He had known something, perhaps more than one something. Diana, in turn, had handled the conversation like a chess clock, counting down her words, choosing each with care, measuring the time before each polite interjection. That was not the mark of an innocent woman surprised by gossip. It was the tension of one playing a role she could barely keep straight. At precisely 9 o'clock, just as Miss Marple was pouring herself a modest sherry, Inspector Slack returned, not through the front, but via the back path, his footsteps intentionally muted. He entered without knocking, his coat damp, his brow lined with thought. "She's hiding something," he said without preamble. "The girl, Westfield." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet I don't believe she's alone in it." Slack looked surprised, but not disbelieving. "You think Hargreaves is involved?" "I think," she replied, taking a measured sip, "that the question is not who found the letter, but who feared it might be found." A beat of silence passed. "She asked me about the shop keys," Slack said. "Before the incident, said she might want to help inventory. I thought nothing of it." "You wouldn't," she said gently. "She's very good at sounding helpful." Outside, the clouds were folding over one another, dusk bleeding into night. And somewhere, across the green, beneath a lamp or behind a curtain, one of them was preparing their next move. The trap had been set. Now they waited to see who would walk straight into it. Chapter 6. The Final Stitch. No one in St. Mary Mead could remember quite who first whispered it, that Miss Marple had made a discovery of some historical value, but the whisper itself spread with a peculiar energy, more persistent than rain, more enticing than gossip. It passed not through proclamation, but through nods, hesitations, and the clipped phrases shared in queues and over teacups. "Did you hear about the wool shop?" And apparently she found something old, valuable, hidden in a quiet English village, where news often arrived folded inside bread deliveries and left with empty jam jars. This murmur took root. And although Miss Marple had not uttered a word about her findings, not directly, her well-timed inquiries and brief visits to the village archives were enough to ignite curiosity. She knew better than to announce. She allowed the silence to speak for her. for it was the oldest trick in the investigator's book. Truth rarely reveals itself when called upon, but it stirs in the shadow of attention. At Woolen Whispers, the shelves were newly dusted, the knitting baskets aligned too neatly, and a bowl of lavender sat suspiciously poised beside the register. Miss Marple stood behind the counter with a purpose in her posture, her hands never idle but always watchful. She handled yarn as if it were silk spun from court intrigue, occasionally letting slip a sentence that sounded like idle recollection but carried, instead, the precision of bait. My, how curious it is, the way old fibres can preserve even secrets. By Wednesday, her invitation had made its way through the lanes and parlours, a demonstration of antique knitting techniques at her cottage, limited seating, refreshments served, no poster, no formal announcement, but by week's end, nearly everyone in the knitting circle had decided to attend. And among them, two names stood out not for their enthusiasm, but their necessity. Professor Hargreaves, the scholar whose interest in the bone knitting needles had never quite aligned with scholarly detachment, and Diana Westfield, who had lately stopped signing her name on Woolen Whispers receipts. On Saturday morning, the kettle whistled before the sun had fully climbed over the hedgerows. Miss Marple laid out scones with marmalade, arranged seating to ensure visibility of her hands, and tucked a folded parchment into her apron's pocket. A letter, she claimed, recently found in a family sewing chest, allegedly authored by a forgotten lady-in-waiting with ties to the Elizabethan court. She did not say aloud that the parchment was blank. That too was bait. The villagers arrived on time, as they always did for anything involving tea, lace or rumour. But the first to arrive was not Mrs. Harbottle or young Peggy Baines. It was Diana, overdressed in a green silk blouse, hair pinned with precision that defied village simplicity. Her eyes, alert yet strained, sought out the letter before the tea. Miss Marple welcomed her with warmth just shy of affection. Next came Hargreaves, 10 minutes late and feigning fluster. He made a point of noticing the wallpaper, not the guests. He did not ask about the demonstration, but about the provenance of the recently discovered document. When offered a seat, he declined twice before finally accepting the one nearest the writing desk. Colonel Bantry sat in the back garden with a newspaper and a pair of field glasses, appearing idle. Inspector Slack pretended to be on a morning stroll, loitering just past the trellis. Miss Marple had asked only one thing of them: observe. The demonstration began. Miss Marple's fingers moved with dexterity as she showed the differences between Flemish and English pearl casting. She offered commentary on patterns favoured by Tudor queens, and casually referenced how royalty had sometimes encoded messages into fabric, even into needles. The moment she said this, Diana's hand jerked toward her teacup. Hargreaves leaned forward imperceptibly. Then, quite without emphasis, Miss Marple drew the letter from her apron. "I hadn't planned to share this," she said, letting the room lean into her words, "but it may interest some of our more scholarly-minded guests." There was a brief silence, respectful, cautious, as the parchment was placed upon the lace-lined table. Hargreaves rose half an inch from his chair, before catching himself, folding his hands instead, the very picture of measured restraint. Diana's gaze, by contrast, held no such restraint. She stared as though hoping her vision alone might penetrate the fibres. Miss Marple unfolded it with great care, revealing Latin script penned in a flourish unmistakably archaic. "It speaks," she murmured, "of inheritance and betrayal, of trust misplaced, and of one item too delicate for public hands, entrusted instead to a woman of common rank but uncommon loyalty." She let the words dangle like loose thread. Diana shifted. Hargreaves adjusted his cufflinks. The text was, of course, a fabrication, a decoy concocted to press the unspoken truths from flesh and bone. Miss Marple required no confession, only reaction. The room thickened with anticipation. A teaspoon clinked against porcelain. Someone coughed. Diana, unable to feign interest any longer, asked, "And where was this letter found exactly?" "In the base of an old sewing box," Miss Marple replied sweetly, which, curiously, had a compartment designed precisely to hold a needle, not of the ordinary variety, but hollow, sealed with wax. She let the silence grow heavy.
In fact, she continued, I believe it was part of a royal set, crafted not merely for fashion, but for secrecy. We now have 3 accounted for, and where there are 3, there must be more. From the garden, a bird gave a shrill cry. Diana looked as though she might fly apart. Hargreaves leaned back too far, knocking a teacup with his elbow. It fell unbroken but loud. Inspector Slack stepped inside as though casually. Trouble with the weather, he said, though the skies were clear. Mind if I stay till it passes? No one believed him, and no one replied. Miss Marple stood, her hands as steady as her tone. Now then, since we are all here, and since fortune seems to have brought us a most attentive inspector, perhaps we may speak freely. She walked to the bureau, withdrew a velvet pouch, and spilled onto the table 4 bone knitting needles, aged, smooth, each bearing a distinct etching. This set, she said, is incomplete. The missing 5th, where is it? No one answered, so she continued. The letter Diana claimed was from her aunt, Mrs. Blackett, contains no postmark, no return address. Its ink is recent, and the handwriting, when compared to an old diary entry I managed to glimpse during our last circle, does not match. Diana said nothing. Her fingers dug into her sleeves. And what of Miss Patricia Westfield? Marple's voice softened, but struck like thread through canvas. A woman who vanished after a scandal at Thornfield Hall. A woman who, unlike a true niece, would have every reason to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers, even if it meant forging her identity, deceiving a village, and confronting a woman who once served her family with unwavering loyalty. Gasps rippled through the room. I believe, she said, that in a confrontation over the needles, over what they held, Mrs. Blackett was struck. A blunt needle, hollow, yes, but sturdy, left not merely a wound but a secret wound, one few would recognize for what it was. And what followed? A misplaced teacup bearing lipstick, and a museum correspondence burnt, but not wholly destroyed. She turned to Hargreaves. And you withheld your knowledge of their true value. Not for nefarious purpose, perhaps, but for credit, for glory. You knew what they were, but you said nothing. That silence, sir, is your share in the guilt. Hargreaves swallowed. Diana, pale now, stood. I never meant, she began, to commit a twisted murder. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. You did not hesitate, because you believed in a legacy, in a cover-up, long left to dust, and you were driven by more than grief. You were driven by pride. Inspector Slack stepped forward. I believe we've heard enough. Diana did not protest. Her silence confirmed everything. The needles were turned over to the museum. The letter, retained for study, and Woolen Whispers resumed its gentle rhythm, though the whispers for once told of tea and murder, of betrayal and revenge, and of a quiet English village that had once housed a body in the library, and a knitting needle that told the truth. And for those watching closely, where are you watching from, and what do you believe brings justice to such violence? This was Miss Marple's most chilling case. But the question still echoes, who killed Mrs. Blackwood?
Chapter 7. Reflections and Loose Ends. The first snow of the season had not yet come, but the days in St. Mary Mead had grown shorter and the air thinner, as though the village itself was holding its breath after all that had transpired. The scandal had broken like a struck bell, echoing through the lanes and hedgerows with a clarity no whisper could dull. Though the shop had reopened, though the church bells resumed their Sunday duties, and the children once again chalked games onto the cobblestones, something had changed in the way people nodded to one another. There was respect now, tinged with unease. Miss Marple sat near her window, the teapot beside her slightly steaming, the cup cooling just enough to drink. Her knitting needles moved without guidance, muscle memory rather than intent, her focus drawn elsewhere, as if threading thoughts more than wool. She had known from the beginning that this case was different, not in violence or method, but in the quiet truths it forced into the open. What most forget, she thought, is that people don't lie with grand gestures. They lie in the pauses, in the peculiar care taken to remember a name, in the slight overuse of an adjective, or in the changed subject offered too quickly. Diana's performance had not collapsed from confrontation, but from observation. Her silence had outlived its usefulness. Professor Hargreaves had departed the village the morning after the arrest. Not in disgrace, for he was too proud for that, but in an exile of his own making. He left behind no note and no forwarding address, only an unpaid invoice at the Rose and Thorn, and a reputation reduced to footnotes. Diana, meanwhile, had been taken into custody, her name entered in the same ledgers once kept by her ancestors, though now beside different kinds of records. The British Museum had sent a letter, formal but not without warmth. They thanked Miss Marple for preserving national heritage, for her role in safeguarding objects of historical interest. They did not mention the phrase knitting needle killer, though one could sense it between the lines, like a watermark. And yet, even as things returned to order, Miss Marple knew that peace is never without price. In her many years, she had seen too often how secrets create residue, settling like ash in the seams of ordinary life. Some residents would forget, others would remember too well, and a few, those who had seen the letter, the needles, the look on Diana's face, would never again regard a knitting circle as merely domestic. It was a Thursday when Miss Marple returned to her knitting group, exactly 1 month after Diana's arrest, and 2 weeks after the museum's parcel had been collected from the post office by a man in a grey suit who introduced himself only as archival logistics. The circle was smaller now, 2 chairs left respectfully unclaimed, and Mrs. Harbottle's scones notably undersugared, though no one said a word. The atmosphere had changed, not with tension, but with reverence, the way a church quiets before a hymn. Eyes lingered longer on Miss Marple's needles, as if expecting them to yield another confession. She, for her part, chose not to explain anything. Her presence alone was explanation enough. That day she worked with a particular pattern, the lover's knot, intricate, looping, deceptively simple to the untrained eye. Its elegance was in its geometry, its message hidden not in threads but in turns. As she passed her finished row to Peggy for admiration, Miss Marple remarked, not to anyone, and yet to all, the old patterns are often the most telling. People forget they were designed to mean something, a secret, a promise, a warning. No one replied, but several nodded, almost imperceptibly. Outside, the cold had stiffened the hinges on the church gate, and a robin settled on the sill just beyond the window. Its presence was a comfort, a small reminder that seasons turn, and turn again. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most that nature never forgets what it buries. The ground holds more than roots. Tea was poured. The conversation at last returned to mundane affairs, parish fairs, and whose roses had survived the frost, and as the light slipped quietly toward dusk, no one noticed that Miss Marple had begun a new skein, pale lavender wool soft as breath. Her next project, she said, would be a scarf. For warmth, yes, but also, she noted with the faintest smile, for silence. Not every story, after all, demands to be spoken. As dusk settled like velvet across the roofs of St. Mary Mead, the fire crackled in Miss Marple's hearth, a rhythm of homecoming rather than ceremony. She sat in her favourite chair, the one facing the garden, and let the quiet absorb her. On her lap the scarf grew steadily, row by row, each knot a meditation, each loop a letting go. She reflected not with triumph but with a kind of grave curiosity. Why is it, she wondered, that the objects we treasure most are so often entwined with things we dare not say? The royal needles had once been instruments of elegance, then tools of concealment, and finally silent witnesses to a twisted murder disguised by tradition. How easily they had passed through hands, crossing centuries until landing in a wool shop where gossip was currency and betrayal was just another shade of thread. In the corner of the room stood a simple box, oak, lined with green velvet. It contained the last of the surviving needles, now cleaned, catalogued, and ready for delivery. Miss Marple had signed the documentation herself, sealed the crate, and yet delayed its dispatch until the following Monday. Why? She was not entirely certain. Perhaps she simply wanted one more weekend where history felt close enough to breathe. A knock came at the door, not sharp but courteous. It was young Peggy, dropping off a book of lace patterns borrowed weeks ago. She lingered a moment, eyes drawn to the scarf. "Is that the lover's knot, Miss Marple?" "Yes," came the reply, warm as the fire. Peggy tilted her head. "You know, it almost looks like it tells a story."
Miss Marple smiled. It always does. Later that evening, she tucked away her needles and folded the finished scarf into a drawer of cedar. No label, no initials, just the subtle, enduring loops of memory and meaning. Tomorrow would be ordinary again, parcels to post, groceries to collect, and tea at 3. But tonight, she allowed herself the stillness of closure. And as the moon cast its gaze upon the quiet English village, the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. Before we end, tell us, where are you watching from, and what do you believe truly delivers justice in a place like St. Mary Mead? Was it the evidence or the intuition? If you followed Miss Marple's most chilling case all the way here, from tea and knitting to twisted murder and brutal betrayal, this is your moment to reflect, share and subscribe. Join us for more stories, stitched with secrets and truth. After all, some patterns hide more than beauty. They carry the weight of a secret crime, a guilty conscience, and the quiet reckoning of a mind that never forgets.